A look at a preview of today's hearing. I'm joined by Republican Representative Scott Garrett of New Jersey, who serves on the House Financial Services Committee. Congressman, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Good morning to you. Good to be with you.
You know, you held your first hearing back in January, and I understand Markopolos was originally supposed to come, didn't come to that hearing. What's the objective of today's hearings?
Well, to find out, well, his story, if you will, as to how he knew about it, how an individual without all the millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of resources that the SEC has at its disposal, and they couldn't discover it, they couldn't bring it to light. But here's an individual basically on his own with just a few others helping him, what have you, to do some of the background investigation. He was able to discover it. You know, but for the confession, if you will, by Madoff to his sons, you and I would probably not be having this discussion right here, right now, because there would never have been an uncovering of this by the SEC. This action, when civil and criminal actions would never be forward, Madoff would be still engaged in what he was engaged in.
You know, it's amazing. We have some of the testimony, the prepared testimony of what he's expected to say later today, and he talks about appearing and sending, you know, notes and phone calls. He specifically talks about one woman who he spoke to very consistently, who he started to feel like, you know, that his family was in danger, that perhaps, you know, something was going on here. You know, you hear about this. What do you make of this? What does it suggest about the SEC? I'm sure you're going to have some tough questions for them.
We're going to have a lot of tough questions for them, but I can predict this, that we're not going to get a whole lot of answers. That just as in the Senate, the SEC will probably respond back to saying, look, there's a civil action going on, there's a criminal action going on right now. We're not going to be able to answer the most fundamental questions, the questions that the American taxpayer and the public and all those people that had invested there are going to want to know. What did the SEC know? Why didn't they follow up on the tips that they were given? And why were they not able to uncover what private citizens were able to uncover?
Yeah, and Congressman, I understand that SEC regulators Linda Thompson and Lori Richards will both be there. They missed the role, you know, what he was suggesting in this case of fraud. They will appear there. But we do notice that the New York branch chief, Megan Chung, is the one who's repeatedly mentioned in his reports and conversations. Will she appear?
I don't have information on whether she is. I'm not sure she's on my list right here. But at the end of the day, whether she's there or the other people are there, we're not going to get to the bottom of it today, which tells you a couple things. One, or lays out a couple problems for us, and that is we know from the other side of the aisle that the response is going to be that there's a problem at the SEC. We can resolve this by new laws, new regulations, and throwing more money at the SEC. First of all, we should never even get to that point until we get all the answers to the questions that you and I are raising right here. So should not be moving precipitously on this. And secondly, we can take out of this hearing today, I think, that all the talk that we'll probably hear is that there are gaps in regulation, there are gaps as far as authority. Those really is not true, because the problems that are out there with regard to this whole situation, there were regulations in place. The broker side of the deal is regulated and enforced, and there's coverage there for enforcement. And the investment advisor aspect of this aspect, also there's already laws on the books, and there's aspects that should be covered there as well. So there's no gap in coverage. There may be a problem of sharing of information, but that just goes to whether these agencies enforce and communicate with each other.
Yeah, you know, we have talked to some former heads of SEC, including Harvey Pitt, William Donaldson, who have all suggested that perhaps not only is it an issue of the amount of people who work for the SEC, but it's also an issue of their knowledge and ability to disseminate what it is that a gentleman like this was trying to suggest that was going on for a long time. If they didn't recognize a red flag, nor did any of the clients, as we just talked about in that last piece, that perhaps we need to do something about transparency, advocating on behalf of the consumer. Is that some of what you hope to accomplish, that the rules will be changed, the way we look at things, the way that we receive documents in the mail, that will all change as a result of this horrible tragedy?
Well, I'm sure you're going to see a lot of changes come out of it. The real question at the end of them would be, even if those changes were put in place, you know, a couple of years ago, would we have prevented what has occurred here? Like, at the end of the day, we are not going to change human nature. We always know that there'll be people out there, very smart people, who are going to try to circumvent the system, try to commit fraud, whether it's at the $50 billion level or the $5 million level. So that's always going to occur. And yes, it would be good if we have better trained people and the like, But unless they begin to communicate with each other and perform the job as we anticipate they should, these things are going to continue to happen. And finally, on this point, your previous little story that you had with regard to an investor here, the old saying that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. When he heard that Madoff's rate of return was just always consistent, always above the standard, and somehow he was able to do it, and nobody else in the entire marketplace was able to accomplish that, that should have raised a red flag for the investor, not pointing any fingers at the investors here, but for due diligence there as to exactly how does Madoff perform when nobody else can perform like that. You can't put all your reliance on the government to always protect it, because as we see here and in other situations as well, the government just can't always do it.
Just finally, when do you think that we will be able to actually see some reforms as a result of this? It appears as though we keep having this conversation about what happened, but we want to know when we'll see changes. When do you think we can start to see those?
Well, you really only should see those changes until after we find out what happened. It would be wrong for Congress to come up with a piece of legislation today, tomorrow, or next week before we have the answers to the questions that I just raised and still don't have, and I guarantee we will not have at the end of this hearing. What did the SEC do back in 2006? Why did they close down the investigation on him in 2006 before they completed, found out this out? Why didn't the SEC turn over the information over to FINRA and suggest to FINRA that they should do a complete audit of Madoff, knowing that the SEC did at that time that he just filed as an investment advisor at that period of time? All those questions have to be answered before we can lay out a broad new plan of filling in anything that needs to be done.
All right. Well, Representative Scott Garrett, great questions. I look forward to seeing more of this later today. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
All right. Coming up, stimulus showdown on the Hill. Charles Payne tells us what President Obama needs to do with the pork, and time